Good afternoon, everyone. All right, we're going to start our program now, looking at North America. I'm Steve Petrus. I'm actually from former chair of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and I had been, by the way, a member of the board, the national board of WACA. For 7 years, I served as vice chair. In fact, I was. And I'm also the U.S. National Director of the Canada-United States Law Institute. And we're sponsoring today's conference right now. And I'm very happy to do that. The Canada-U.S. Law Institute, by the way, will celebrate 50 years in 2026. And on your table, there's a flyer that talks about our annual conference, which will be April 16 and 17 in Cleveland. So I hope you can all join us there, because we are great neighbors. There's been a lot of challenges, right, in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada relationship, and that's what we're here to discuss. And it's very interesting. We have a fabulous panel, and I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel, Ned Price. Ned has a very interesting background, because he was an analyst at the CIA. He went into the State Department. He served actually as the spokesman for the State Department for many years. And then he wound up being the deputy, I've got to get your title right, the deputy director of the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and he served in that capacity. He has a very interesting background. He's written some very interesting papers, some controversial, that appeared in, opinions that I read about. And what's very interesting is we have a lot of interesting people here. I just want to say a couple of things. Chris Sands is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University, the School of Advanced International Studies. But even more importantly than that, he's a member of the executive committee of the Canada-United States Law Institute. And what's even more fascinating is that Ambassador Sukharan, he is a graduate of SAIS. So we're all related. All right. Turn it over to you, Ned.
Great. Steve, thank you very much for those kind introductions. I think Steve gave a very quick synopsis of who I am. I think he might have left out the most important element. My first internship in college was with the World Affairs Council of Dallas, Texas, where I'm from. Wanted to make that clear. But we're very pleased to be here today, and more so to really be here discussing a defining set of challenges and opportunities that are very close to home for all of us. I think it's only appropriate to start by quoting the noted foreign policy strategist, Mr. Rogers, who would often say that it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And so I think I want to talk to our panelists today about whether that still stands, and whether the challenges and opportunities that both face and beset the relationship have changed that, whether it's migration, trade, energy, and politics, among many others. And as Steve said, we are really lucky to have two esteemed panelists with us today. We have Ambassador Sarukhan. Ambassador Sarukhan is the founder and president of Sarukhan Associates. He previously served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013. As I understand it, you were the youngest and longest serving envoy in that capacity. And we also have Chris Sands. Chris is the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, and he co-chairs the SAIS Academy for North America with Ambassador Sarukhan. And Chris, I might have discovered a piece of oppo on you. I understand you're actually not Canadian, but what you lack in citizenship, maybe I'm sure you make up for in expertise.
Well, I'm proud to be an American, but I like the Canadian.
Good.
They're very nice. I speak Canadian pretty fluently.
Good. All right. We'll hear a lot of that. I want to start first by omitting what we might call the red, white, and blue elephant in the room, and just talk about the bilateral relationship between Canada and Mexico. And it's a relationship that, of course, has evolved in recent years. But I'm hoping I can just put both of you on the spot to talk about how you see that bilateral relationship between those two countries. So, Ambassador, do you want to start?
Thank you, Ned, and it's a pleasure to be here, given that we're providing shout-outs to the World Affairs Council. I'm very honored to be back because one of the last things I did as an ambassador was I was honored by the World Affairs Council for my 6 years in service as ambassador. So when I got the invite to come, I said, of course, I'll be there. I still, when Gary Dewar, who was the Canadian ambassador to the United States, and I were advocating for Canada and Mexico's entry into what was at the time the most ambitious free trade negotiation, the famous transatlantic, Trans-Pacific Agreement, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We had to lobby not only the administration, but we had to go and lobby governors, because there were several governors who were deeply involved in the negotiation process with the Obama administration. And so he and I sort of did a bit of a roadshow in the United States for quite some time. And I would always joke that Canadians and Mexicans had one thing in common, which was that we both lived next to an elephant, but it was much better to be on top of the elephant than underneath the elephant. What that did miss, however, was the very particular and complex dynamics of Canada-Mexico relations. And in many ways, I think, Ned, sort of we've got to do a bit of, I won't bore you, don't worry, your eyes won't glaze over, but sort of the genesis of where we are today, in many ways, was born out of the process to negotiate NAFTA. Remember that when Mexico comes to Washington and tells the Bush 41 administration, we want to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, which was a stunning thing because it was the first time in the history of trade that an emerging economy was going to be negotiating a free trade agreement with an industrialized nation. Remember that this was in 1991. In 1988, Canada and the United States had finalized their bilateral FTA. And so the first reaction by our Canadian friends when they heard the Mexicans went up to Washington to sort of request negotiations for an FTA was, we don't mind, we've got our bilateral trade agreement with the United States. But very, very quickly, they figured out that if they didn't jump on board, simply the size of the Mexican economy and the dynamics that would be uncorked by a free trade agreement between Mexico and the United States would mean that Canada would fall over the wayside. And that dynamic has sort of played a role time and again in Canada-Mexico relationships, because and you always, as in most relationships, you need two to tango. Mexico has consistently not invested political capital in the relationship with Canada, and Canada has consistently annoyed Mexico or stuck its finger in Mexico's eye. First of all, because in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in 2001, as Mexico and Canada very quickly figured out that the free trade edifice that we had been building would collapse if there was a perception in the United States that either border was a threat to the national security of the United States, we very quickly understood that common prosperity and common security were completely interwoven. But what happened is that time, the Canadian government at the time, started getting itchy because, in their words, they didn't want to see the Mexicanization of their bilateral agenda with the United States. You can imagine how that went down well with the Mexican government at the time, with yours truly, who was head of policy planning at the time in the Mexican Foreign Ministry. And since then, Canada has been very ambivalent about this three-way relationship with Mexico, because they feel that on many issues, they do need the boombox with Mexico in dealing with the United States, because that helps both of us level the playing field. It helps to diffuse pressures and leverage from the United States. But at the same time, they're so concerned that Mexico will suck the oxygen out of the room from their relationship with the United States, that you've seen this dynamic play in and out for several decades. And then in the renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA during the first Trump administration, there was a moment where the Trump administration was frustrated that the Canadians weren't acceding to the demands that the United States was putting on the table for Canada. And so they basically went to the Mexicans and said, let's screw the Canadians, let's sign the deal, and if they want to join or not, it's their problem. And Mexico said, no can do, we're going to wait for the Canadians. How did we get paid back? I'm giving you sort of how this is perceived, and doesn't mean that I necessarily subscribe to this narrative. But then what happens? Trump wins again, and in November, when he starts talking about the weaponization of tariffs and that he's going to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico, blah, 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 two premiers, Ontario and Alberta, come out and openly say, let's throw the Mexicans under the bus and let's negotiate with Trump bilaterally. So that dynamic has been very complex, but I must say, this isn't only about Canada. The last 6 years of the previous Mexican president saw zero diplomatic investment and bandwidth by Mexico in the relationship with Canada. So I think both countries right now, with what's coming down the turnpike, with the statutory revision of the USMCA, I think they need to get together and they need to deepen that relationship. And I hope that Prime Minister Carney's trip to Mexico 2 months ago is a first signal that Mexico and Canada will start working closer hand in hand, because we'll probably talk about this. One of the potential outcomes of that review process of USMCA is that I think that the Trump administration would like to see two bilateral deals instead of a trilateral regional North American free trade agreement. And that's going to mean Canada and Mexico are going to have to work hand in hand. Sorry, long-winded response.
No. Good. Chris, B from Ottawa, do you agree with that? Is it anything you'd take issue with?
Yes. What I always used to say about this relationship is, if some of you remember, there's a movie called The Good Son with Macaulay Culkin before he turned bad and Elijah Wood before he became a hobbit. And the premise of the movie is poor Elijah Wood's house is burned down or whatever, and so the family takes him in, and Macaulay Culkin's the good son. So every time he's around, I mean, he's being sweet, but as soon as the parents are out of the picture, he's trying to push Elijah Wood off a cliff or throw him in front of a bus. And that's been the dynamic. The Canadians believed they had a very special relationship with the U.S., and they didn't want anybody sharing it. They wanted just to be able to do everything bilaterally. And I think they felt that they had a special understanding with us, maybe not so much with the Trump administration, but in general. And they wanted to preserve that and didn't really appreciate having another supplicant. I remember when I was in my early think tank career, I had a chance to work with a great scholar, Sidney Weintraub. He was wonderful. He'd been at the State Department a long time. And he wrote a book about U.S.-Mexico relations. He called it A Marriage of Convenience. And I remember he did a book talk on it, and one of the people in the audience got up and said, yes, it's a marriage of convenience, Sidney. But the problem isn't that. The problem is you Americans sleep around. And this is sort of the other side of it. We have special relationships with everybody, even if they're especially bad. So Canada has generally been, I think, the least trilateral of the three partners, the least willing to give this a chance, Gary Dewar notwithstanding. But what I would say, which is where Ambassador Sarah ended, which is really important, is that Mark Carney has been different. And he made the conscious effort to invite Claudia Sheinbaum, a new president, to come to the G7 summit in Kananaskis. Mexico often attends G7s as part of a G7 plus, but is not a normal member. He invited her up. She came.
After a lot of cajoling, pushing, and dragging, but she did.
And Trump left before she got there, but they at least had a chance to chat. And then Canada made the gesture of actually going and state this. I was trying to think when the last time Canada sent the Prime Minister down on an official visit to Mexico.
On a bilat, it was...
Maybe Pierre Trudeau and Lopez Portillo?
No. It was... I think it was No, it wasn't Harper. It was... See, we can't even figure out when the last time a bilateral... Because Canadian prime ministers have gone down to Mexico, but for the North American Leaders Summit.
Right, or the G20 or something else. So it was really remarkable. He's made an effort, and I think it's been smart. He's been respectful of the Mexican position, partly because he knows he's in a negotiation with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump uses every trick in the book when he negotiates. And I think Mark Carney's been very concerned about a divide and conquer play between the U.S. and between Canada and Mexico, just as Ambassador Sarkhan mentioned, but also he's worried about a divide and conquer turning Alberta against Ontario, against Quebec, because it's going to make his home field quite difficult. So, yeah, Canada's the bad boy, but it is getting better.
So we've started to go there with this conversation. So I want to continue to pull the thread. There's another set of bilateral relationships in this partnership, the bilateral relationships between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. And I think maybe somewhat improbably, both of these leaders have managed to have fairly productive, at times, relationships with President Trump. And I think they've defied expectations in some ways. So I want to turn to that set of bilateral relationships. And Chris, if you want to start, and we've obviously seen some ups and downs with the Prime Minister and President Trump, and Canada's federal system has given it some troubles recently. But how would you characterize that, and what has the Prime Minister done well as he has tried to manage this relationship?
So I think Mark Carney benefits from not being Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
And Justin Trudeau, we all remember when he came on the scene, was, very, had a bit of star quality. But over time, he really burned his bridges with Donald Trump. And I would say during the Biden years, that was the worst, because he spent a lot of time talking about his conservative opposition as being J6 insurrectionists, MAGA light, all of this sort of stuff. And whatever you can say about what Donald Trump knows about Canada, he knows when people talk about him, and he knows when people talk about him in not a nice way. So Justin Trudeau really had no chance with the second Trump administration. He was toast, but didn't seem to bring that on board. So he came down to Mar-a-Lago after the election, before the inauguration, to try to see if he could restart. And he played the same playbook he did the first time, not getting flustered, trying to be friendly, get the handshake right. And it was not good. And my understanding of this from various people involved is he invited himself in the middle of a week when it was nothing but governors coming down to say hello to the president. So when Justin Trudeau comes, he's like, "Oh, who do we have here? Oh, the Governor Trudeau of the great state of Canada." And Trudeau's kind of annoyed, and that's the worst thing with a bully. Never admit you're annoyed, because then he just kept going at it and talked about 51st state and didn't know when to let it go. In the end, I'll give Trudeau some credit. What he managed to do was to turn insulting Trudeau into insulting the country and build up a lot of nationalist angst that made people quite upset. But Canadians, even when they're nationalist and upset, are still very pragmatic. And they chose Mark Carney because he was a grown-up, he was serious, and they figured he would be the better potential partner for Donald Trump. And he's come in, and I think he's tried to manage this by not getting upset, by continuing to be friendly, say positive things. And so far, it hasn't been easy. If I were to be critical of Donald Trump, not that he cares what I think there hasn't been enough reciprocation. He's tried to sort of address all of the major things. For example, we all know Americans complain Canada doesn't spend enough on defense. The NATO commitment going back to 2011, 2% of GDP. And they don't spend that much. They're about at 1.37. But Carney came in and said, I'm going to do 2% this year. And we just had the budget last week, week before last, and he actually did get to 2%. And they had the budget vote on Monday, and that's where they were. So very striking that and he didn't do that conditionally. I'll do this, and now you have to do something for me. He took a real chance. And I don't think there's been enough reciprocation from the Trump administration to say, okay, we recognize you're trying more than Trudeau, so let's see if we can't work out some of our other differences.
So with the Prime Minister's pragmatic approach, how is that playing politically back home? Obviously, Prime Minister Carney carries that title in large part because of the nationalist sentiment that President Trump stirred up. But is there a desire on the part of Canadians to see more backbone, more fight?
A sort of anxious desire, because they want the relationship to be good. They just don't know if good is possible. And one of the things that happens in Canada typically is that the party that's in government in Ottawa is not in power in the provinces. And there are only a couple Liberal premiers. And so you have strong conservative leaders like Danielle Smith from Alberta, Doug Ford from Ontario, and François Legault from Quebec. They are all conservative in slightly different ways, but they all represent that side of the spectrum. And those are the first, second, and fourth largest provinces, so they matter. And they've been very sympathetic to some of Trump's arguments. They've tried in different ways to kind of meet him halfway, but now they're starting to worry that Howard Lutnick says all the auto industry has to move back to the United States, and that's bad for Ontario. And Alberta wants to sell more oil and has revived the idea of the Keystone XL pipeline, which may or may not go. But they're trying, but they're not getting anything back, and so they're beginning to get nervous at home. Whereas I think Carney has stayed at the table, but if he doesn't get some sort of benefit from staying at the table, I don't think he'll turn rogue. I think that the Canadians may just choose a different leader who is not as friendly to the United States.
Ambassador, I want to turn the same variation of the question to you, the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. And I think it's fair to say the relationship President Trump had with President Sheinbaum's predecessor was somewhat surprising, given the campaign rhetoric and building the wall and Mexico paying for it. And it seems like, at least so far, the relationship is shaping up in similar ways, but would be interested to hear your thoughts on at least the perception that President Sheinbaum is playing this well.
Yeah, regarding Trump and López Obrador, I always said that they're twins from a different mother. And that, in part, explains the dynamics that we all saw between both individuals. Also, López Obrador very quickly understood that beyond the issues related to the border, President Trump didn't give a hoot about anything else in the bilateral agenda or in Mexican domestic political affairs. In fact, I have an anecdote when Trump congratulated López Obrador, and López Obrador sent him one of these waxing full-page letters and made it public. And towards the end, he sort of said, you know, you and I are the same because we defeated the establishments and the mafia of power of both countries. I don't want to tell you that 2 phone calls from 2 very prominent women in the Democratic Party who said basically, what the hell is this? And when I sort of conveyed the message to who was then slated to become López Obrador's foreign secretary and said, you'd better watch out. And when he told me what had happened as a result of the conversation between López Obrador, then president-elect, and the guy who would become his foreign secretary, the reaction was basically, screw the Democrats, I don't care. And this in part is because of his conviction that the Democrats do talk about issues that he deems are the sole purview of Mexico and Mexicans: democracy, human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I must say that President Sheinbaum's relationship with Trump has stayed on an even keel, in part because Trump sees her as sort of the protégé of López Obrador, someone who he professes to still like, but also because I think Sheinbaum has been very careful and I think intelligent in not using the presidential bully pulpit to pick fights with Donald Trump, which is a challenge because she's continued the terrible tradition of López Obrador of giving a daily morning press conference at 7 a.m. in the morning. So every day the reporters are going back and forth on everything that Trump says and does, and she has to duck and bob and weave. But so far she's been pretty successful in sort of not falling into the trap of responding to everything that Donald Trump says on a given day. And that, I think, has helped to sort of mitigate some of the potential pressure points. The other thing is, I have to say this, things are going well because Trump put a gun to Mexico's head and Mexico has basically bent the knee. And Mexico is doing a lot of what Trump has demanded of Mexico, whether it's immigration control, whether it's upping the ante in the fight against organized crime. I think it's more of a tactical shift in Mexico than a strategic shift. But, you know, the narrative coming out of the White House is Mexico is supporting us on immigration. Look at the numbers. And Mexico has started to do more in curbing fentanyl trafficking on the way to the United States. Having said all of this, even though if both leaders have more or less maintained things on an even keel, the statements coming out from President Trump are sort of, on the one hand, he says, I like her very much, but Mexico is this and Mexico is that. And that's gonna at some point create, I think, an important tension point and conflict with Mexico. The other thing is that at one point, she's going to have FaceTime with President Trump. So far, she's one of the very, very few key allies and partners of the United States that has not had a bilateral face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. There are many in Mexico who would argue, based on this record, well, things aren't going too bad for her. She should continue to do what she's doing and avoid sort of being ambushed in the Oval Office.
Ask President Zelensky about that, yes.
You know, Zelensky and so many others. But at some point, this relationship, with my respects to my Canadian friends, there's no bilateral relationship on the face of the earth so complex and so critically important for the daily well-being, security, and prosperity of Americans than the bilateral relationship with Mexico. And given what we have in front of us, drugs and thugs, but more importantly, one track to solve the weaponization of tariffs, all the tariffs that President Trump has applied under the IEEPA or under Section 301 or 232. And the second track will be the statutory review of USMCA, which is slated to start July 1st of next year. But every indication that we have is that the Trump administration will try to front load this and start somewhere January, February at the latest. Given that, she's going to have to sit down with him at some point. And what you mentioned, Chris, the fact that she does not, like her predecessor, she does not like foreign policy. She does not like to travel abroad. The difference is that whereas López Obrador would, paint the finger at foreign policy, she at least doesn't do it. But she's now lost two opportunities to have face-to-face time with Trump in a context which isn't the Oval Office or the White House or Washington, D.C. The first one was the G7 summit. She didn't arrive in time because the previous government sold the presidential plane, so she had to travel commercial to Canada. She arrived 5 hours late to the summit, and by that time, Trump had decided that he was coming back to D.C. because of what was happening.
5 hours late? Did she take Air Canada?
She took Air Canada. and then the second one, she didn't go to the APEC summit in South Korea, where she would have had a chance to have a bilateral meeting with President Trump. So at some point, sort of this peachy at a distance dynamic is gonna meet reality, and then we'll see, because we are, I'll say it out clearly and plainly, we are witnessing one of the low points in Mexico-U.S. bilateral relationship in modern history.
Mm-hmm. So far, two rather pragmatic, and because of that, at least so far, stable relationships between and among these countries. I want to ask both of you about two wild cards. Ambassador, I'll start with you. We've heard rumors for months now, since the earliest days of the Trump administration, that the administration's efforts to go after narco-traffickers, narco-terrorists, as they call them, may lead the administration to undertake military operations on Mexican soil. And there's been mixed reporting about whether that would be unilateral operations, how the extent to which the government of Mexico would be involved or even witting of this. How would that change the relationship? And would the stability of the relationship be able to survive something like that?
Yeah, that's the whatever the amount is these days. That's a $65,000 question, or whatever the pot of money is these days when you play the game. Because if there were to be a unilateral use of force by the United States on Mexican soil, that's going to blow up the relationship. And let me say this, no Mexican president, whether of the left, the right, the center, would be able to maintain the relationship on an even keel if there were to be a unilateral use of force by the United States. We're all reading the same newspapers, we're all seeing the same types of analysis. I would probably point to the fact that I think whereas what you're seeing in Venezuela clearly, I think it has several contexts. It's a geopolitical context in President Trump's mind of understanding global politics as spheres of influence, but it's also got a bit of a shock and awe effect in, I think, hopefully thinking that maybe this will entice the Venezuelan military to put Maduro on a plane to Havana or Moscow. With Mexico, it is different, because I think there are individuals in the administration, and I'll point to why I think this, that do understand the strategic underpinnings of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, regardless of the focus on fentanyl and drug trafficking and law enforcement. Trump, as you've all seen, has been continuously saying, it's not off the table. I'm still thinking of bombing Mexico, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, who on the tarmac at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Ottawa last week, explicitly said, we're not going to unilaterally resort to the use of force in Mexico. We can provide military support if the Mexican government requests that type of support. Sheinbaum has clearly said that she's not willing to accept U.S. boots on the ground or military support, which puts all of this in a bit of in flux. Because if I were her, I would do three things. I would explicitly, openly state that there's no more important threat to Mexican sovereignty than the activities of transnational criminal organizations operating on both sides of our common border. Number two, that she is willing to rebuild security collaboration that we built when I was ambassador, that we built with the United States and which was eviscerated by López Obrador.
Chris, the other wild card I think we have raised a couple of times is USMCA and the statutory review of it. The trilateral relationship, I think it's fair to say, but would welcome disagreements, has underperformed since it's really been on the table, and we've come a long way since even the heyday of Obama, Trudeau, Peña Nieto. And so I'm curious what the trilateral relationship would be capable of were USMCA turned into separate bilateral agreements. Would that be the end of an important element of trilateral cooperation? And what good would this trilateral relationship do? What could these countries do together if not trade?
Go back to Brian Mulroney. Some of you will remember he was Prime Minister of Canada when they negotiated not only the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, but also NAFTA. And one of the things he said about bringing Canada into the discussions between the U.S. and Mexico about NAFTA was that if that didn't happen, then the U.S. would be a hub and Canada and Mexico would be spokes. And that would be a disadvantage for Canada. And I think you see that strategy now playing out. The U.S. is the heart of our economy because there's so many consumers there, et cetera. And the Trump administration is trying to leverage that to bring more things home. Tony Pehan at Rice likes to say it's clear that the U.S. believes in reshoring. It's not clear the U.S. believes in nearshoring.
They don't.
And that means bringing things to the U.S., which is good. I mean, good for the United States, but coming at the expense of our allies makes it a very predatory relationship. If we take a positive side, though, I think there's a lot that we could be doing within the USMCA review, and then I'll have one depressing thing to say. For example, we know that we need critical minerals. That's been on the table for a while. And critical minerals, we're not only behind in getting them, we're behind in processing. And processing plants are expensive, and we're not going to build one in every town.
And they're not popular.
And they're not popular. So we have to figure out a way that we're going to develop this industry jointly. There's a little bit of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which didn't apply to Mexico when we did NAFTA, which said that in the area of energy, because Trudeau, the father, Pierre Trudeau, had been interventionist in the oil sector, said that in times of shortage, neither country will stop shipping to the other, that they will just honor contracts. We could do that on critical minerals to make sure that the processing plants still get their supplies even when there's tightness around the world. That's the kind of thing cooperation can do. One of the things the State Department's been pushing, I think, very constructively is this 100,000 strong engagement of international students. And we're all seeing fewer students from China and other places coming for a variety of reasons. why not go into the temporary entry provisions of the USMCA and say, we're going to have an expedited student visa for Mexicans, Canadians, and Americans studying at each other's schools?
Or in the context of the World Cup, the North American World Cup, which, by the way, was my baby as ambassador. I was the one that started saying, until President Obama said, that's a great idea, but why don't we? Because I was talking about a U.S.-Mexico World Cup, because Canadians really don't care about soccer, even though they have the best soccer team in North America right now.
They do.
And sort of Obama, who was desperate of, in improving his relationship with Harper, said, why don't we turn it into a North American World Cup? But to your point, Mexico has a trusted traveler program with the United States. Canada has a trusted traveler program with the United States. But the three mechanisms don't sync and don't talk to one another. Let's develop a true North American trusted traveler program for Mexicans, Americans, and Canadians. The excuse would be so our fans can travel freely between three countries during the World Cup. But in terms of security, in terms of knowing who's using these mechanisms and systems, it would improve our border control and our security immensely. Or another factor, the U.S. is involved in the most important recalibration of its foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And that recalibration, obviously, is the relationship with China, both militarily, geopolitically, but also in trade, in the economy, commerce, innovation, technology. If that recalibration strategy is going to succeed, it requires Canada and Mexico as key components of that recalibration to deepen and Teflon coat supply chains, to include a critical minerals chapter in the review of USMCA, to think of cybersecurity in a regional context, and to really bind the concept of economic security with territorial security. That is common domain awareness for North America as it relates to China and as it relates to other extra-hemispheric players who are aggressively pursuing their agenda in the Americas today. And I'm talking about basically Russia and Iran.
We will open it up to questions in just one moment. So please, I think we'll have microphones in the room. If you do have questions, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Chris, a final question for you. Intriguing idea to have a trilateral trusted traveler program is if you could name one proposal, sort of wave a magic wand to improve the state of the trilateral relationship, how would you think about that? What would that be?
It's a little complicated, but it builds on what Ambassador Sarkhan was just saying. One of the challenges of China is their overproduction of everything, and they can't consume it all, so they rely on exporting it to everybody. And they dump it everywhere. And when they can't get it into a market, they sometimes relabel it or shift it through Serbia, and it comes to us from what we think is Serbia, but it's really Chinese steel, or Thailand, or whatever. The future, I think, of supply chains includes making sure that they are accountable and transparent, and you know what's in them. Now, all the things that we can do technologically in North America to optimize our supply chains could include dealing with traceability and making sure that embargoed goods, sanctioned goods, goods made with forced labor from Xinjiang province are all kept out of all of the North American economy. I think it'll build trust, requires technology, but it's something we could very much do if we had the goodwill on all sides to trust each other, share more intelligence. Mexico gets certain intelligence, but not as much as Canada, and we have to come around to thinking about that. I know a customs union is far off, but a sanctions union where we actually agree that certain bad actors really need to be punished, I think that's much more doable.
Okay, I hope the three leaders are listening. We will turn to the audience now for questions. If you just wouldn't mind raising your hand over here.
Hi, my name is Alberto Gonzalez. I'm a student at Texas A&M International University. I'm here with the World Council of Laredo. I'm originally from Monterrey, Mexico. And my question goes around, well, one experience that we had yesterday, we went to the Embassy of Mexico Student Scholars Program, and I asked a question very similar to what we were talking about of having this public perception of how, for example, as Ambassador was talking about Mexico bending their knee when Trump was putting the gun in Mexico's head. So how do you work after knowing of the U.S. economy sustainability being very large amount part of this trilateral relation on 1.6 trillion of the U.S. Imports and exports were through this relation, and 33% of the exports of the U.S. were to Canada or to Mexico. This represents a lot of sustainability between this relation, and what's the work ethic that you guys had in your positions to change this public perception into being something where, well, I used this term yesterday in the embassy, and I don't know if it's a little bit not good to say, but not being the little brother of the U.S. and being like even and hand to hand. Thank you.
Well, it's there's you can't hide the fact that there is a real power asymmetry between Mexico and the United States. It exists. It's there. It's real. But I think that what Mexico had been doing in the past was changing the dynamics and the perceptions in the bilateral relationship of becoming. I always chastised my friends and colleagues at the State Department at the time who thought that Brazil was the natural strategic partner of the United States in the hemisphere. And they said, you guys have been drinking too much Brazilian coffee, because what you haven't realized is that Brazil, through NASUR and other initiatives, has been trying to strategically decouple the United States from Latin America and the Caribbean. Why? Because Brazil wants a UN Permanent Security Council seat, and the way that it does that is become the hegemon in Latin America and the Caribbean. And my argument was Mexico is the United States' true strategic partner in the region. And, it's one thing to talk the talk, it's another to walk the walk. How did we walk the walk? That despite those asymmetries and despite the differences and the conflicts that in an asymmetrical relationship like this inevitably arise, that we had a common thread of values, not only regarding our bilateral relationship, in the sense that we are joined at the hip for the good, and you can't press Control Alt Delete and erase Mexico from the southern border. But also in terms of our outlooks in the region and the world. And what was incredibly interesting at the time was that our bilateral law enforcement and security and intelligence relationship morphed into something that went beyond the bilateral relationship. We started talking about Libya and the Middle East and Cuba and Venezuela and Greenland, and of Mexico becoming a major non-NATO ally of the United States, in ways that had never happened in the history of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. All that has now been lost. So you need in some way to recover. You have to have the strategic bandwidth, appetite, vision, which I'm afraid is sorely lacking in Mexico today when it comes to foreign policy. But B, you have to have a willing partner in Washington and in the White House, which I must say we also don't have today. So it's a bit of a complex dynamic, but I think that what Mexico needs to do is roll up its sleeves again, go out beyond the Beltway. Mexican diplomacy is too much focused within the Beltway these days. We're not doing our job with governors and mayors of this country. Mexico not only is the U.S.'s largest trading partner, we surpassed China last year. We are now the U.S.'s largest market in the world. And so that gives you an ability to leverage and to engage and to create advocacy networks in this country, which unfortunately the Mexican government is not doing. Whether it's parochialism, lack of appetite, lack of understanding, the impact of having destroyed Mexican bureaucracy over the past 6 years and eviscerated the Mexican government. But the reality is that Mexico needs to pick up that game again.
Told we have time for a final question. Yes, in the back there.
You're good at this. You must have been doing like spokesman stuff. You're always calling on people so well.
Practice.
Yeah.
Angela Weck, Peoria, Illinois. I am proud to say that we have had the Consuls General of Canada and Mexico come to Peoria to speak to our chambers of commerce, our elected officials, and of course the World Affairs Council there. We have had some very productive agricultural, industrial, educational exchange conversations. And I agree that we should have more of these come out to the everyday people, because the everyday people depend on what you do. How do you promote getting out to the regions? So both the Consuls General of Canada in Chicago and Ambassador Reina in Torres in Chicago as well have been very generous with their time. Is that true for all of the areas that Consuls General serve?
Well, I no longer do it because I left the Foreign Service a long time ago. I'm I'm going to parade my wares and say very proudly that Reina Torres was part of my team when I was ambassador. And so I think, and I hope that what you're seeing in Chicago is the product of a group of foreign diplomats that understood the name of the game that I just described. It's not going to be the same. There are some very good Mexican consul generals. We have the largest consular network any country has in any other country. We've got 52 career Mexican, not honorary, career Mexican consulates in the United States. I think the country that follows us it's either Canada or the UK with 12, I think.
Canada has 13, if you count the embassy, so yeah.
So imagine the gap between the number one with 52 and then the next one with 13 or 14. So it's a huge operation that we have in the United States. It's very disparate, particularly because in the last 6 years, the Mexican government, the party that has been in power the past 6 years and is still in power, has used those positions to reward political allies. So whereas we've got some very good people like Reina Torres in Chicago, I'm not going to start naming names, but we've got several consulates in the US which are a disgrace. So a lot of that, again, depends on the willingness to really understand the ability of how you use such a powerful tool as Mexico's consular network in the United States, engaging with civil society, engaging with NGOs, engaging with governors, with mayors, with other relevant stakeholders that are critically important to Mexico, and Mexico's 35 million Mexican-American diaspora in the United States.
If I can answer that slightly different from my Canadian perspective, and I was picking on Justin Trudeau before, and I want to give him some credit because in the run-up to the USMCA negotiations, when we just thought we were maybe renegotiating NAFTA, Canada made a huge effort to understand just how much trade was done with every zip code in the United States, how much Canadian investment was in every area. They had the numbers. And the thing was, the numbers weren't top secret, but they had to go and they dug them up and they came up with the numbers. And you talk to members of Congress and a lot of community leaders, they heard the Canadians coming with the data that said, hey, we're more important than you think we are to you, to your very community. That data has been around us for a long time, and it's a bit embarrassing as an American that we had to have the Canadians show it to us. And as much as the Canadians are charming and persuasive, and consuls general are great, one of the nice pieces of the USMCA, I don't know how it got in there, was a provision that we would try to make publicly accessible government-collected data so that, with personal identifiers out, so that we could better coordinate, et cetera. Well,
and win the hearts and minds of Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans as to the benefits of free trade.
Right. And we now have electronic bills of lading for every truck, every shipment. It tells you what the HS code, so what the product is, what its value was, and where it went. That's data mining heaven. We could figure out how Peoria connects to the global economy with a degree of precision we couldn't have done 20 years ago when we had these agreements come into place. So I think Americans and Canadians and Mexicans need to have a joint project of better understanding what we've just done and how important we are to each other. Because I think if the people broadly understand that, I know this doesn't sound the way it's supposed to go, but I think if the people understand that, the leaders will follow.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This was excellent. So, thank you, Ned Price, for your outstanding performance as our moderator. Thank you, Christopher Sands, for providing us insights on Mexico. And thank you, Ambassador Sarkhan, for your insights on Mexico. We're all neighbors, right? We're all neighbors. This was a great program. I understand now that, don't worry if you're going to miss the bus to the Canadian Embassy. I don't think that's going to happen. But technically, we have a couple of minutes to get to it. So I have fun. Thank you very much.